For decades, people around the world were sold the same dream, a simple, shiny story that sounded almost impossible not to believe. America was presented as the land where anyone could become successful. It didn't matter where you came from, how poor you were, or what your last name was. If you worked hard enough, the future would reward you. Hollywood turned that dream into a global religion. Movies showed perfect suburban neighborhoods with green lawns, smiling families, and endless opportunity. TV shows made ordinary American life look comfortable, safe, and exciting at the same time. Huge cities covered in lights and skyscrapers became symbols of freedom and wealth for the rest of the world. Millions of people grew up believing America was the final destination for success. It looked like a country where the middle class lived better than kings from previous centuries. Big houses, 2 cars in the driveway, shopping malls full of products, unlimited freedom, endless possibilities. But the image was stronger than the reality, because behind the bright advertisements and patriotic speeches, something inside the system slowly started breaking apart. The famous American dream didn't disappear overnight. It decayed quietly for years, while most people kept pretending everything was still normal. Today, millions of Americans work harder than ever, but feel poorer every year. Young people leave college buried under massive debt before their adult lives even begin. Buying a home feels impossible for huge parts of the population. Medical bills destroy families financially. Many workers need 2 or 3 jobs just to survive in cities where rent keeps exploding. At the same time, a tiny group of billionaires became richer than entire countries. Tech elites build private rockets and luxury bunkers, while ordinary people panic over grocery prices and unpaid bills. The gap between rich and poor became so extreme that it no longer feels like one society living together. It feels like 2 completely different worlds existing side by side. And yet the illusion continues. Times Square still glows. Hollywood still produces stories about heroes saving the world. Politicians still talk about opportunity and freedom. But underneath all the lights and slogans, more and more people are starting to realize something uncomfortable. The system that once promised prosperity for everyone now works mainly for the people already at the top. Most people instinctively try to avoid looking at suffering for too long. It's easier to keep walking, turn the music up in the car, and pretend everything around us is still functioning normally. But in modern America, ignoring the collapse is becoming impossible because the crisis is no longer hidden. It's out in the open, right in the middle of some of the richest and most famous cities on Earth. Tourist ads still show California beaches, luxury shopping districts, and shining glass skyscrapers. But walk just a few blocks away from downtown Los Angeles or San Francisco, and the entire picture changes instantly. The illusion disappears. Tents line the sidewalks for miles. Thousands of people live under bridges, beside highways, and in dirty camps built from plastic sheets and broken tops. Streets are covered with trash, needles, human waste, and the smell of chemicals and decay. And this isn't happening in some forgotten third world country. This is happening inside the wealthiest nation on the planet. The drug epidemic made everything even worse. Fentanyl spread through entire neighborhoods like poison. People lose control of their lives in months. Many barely look human anymore. They stand frozen in the middle of sidewalks, bent over, disconnected from reality, slowly destroying themselves in public while everyone walks past. Entire sections of major cities now feel like social collapse happening in real time. Ambulances arrive constantly. Overdose deaths keep rising. Emergency rooms overflow. But the public slowly became numb to it all. People see suffering every day now, so eventually they stop reacting. That may be the darkest part of the story. The crisis stopped shocking society. Politicians call it a complex social challenge. They launch temporary programs and hold press conferences. Clean needles are distributed. New slogans appear every election season. But almost nobody seriously addresses the deeper causes: impossible housing costs, crushing debt, stagnant wages, loneliness, mental exhaustion, and a system where millions feel completely disposable. And the collapse is no longer limited to the poorest people. More and more Americans who once considered themselves middle class are falling into the same spiral. One lost job, one medical emergency, one missed rent payment. That's often all it takes to destroy years of stability. People live with constant fear. Fear of getting sick, fear of losing work, fear of falling behind financially, fear that one mistake could push them into the same nightmare they see growing outside every day. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley continues talking about artificial intelligence, space tourism, and the future of humanity. Billionaires walk into luxury offices while homeless camps expand just blocks away. The contrast became impossible to ignore. A small part of society lives surrounded by wealth, technology, and protection. Another part survives paycheck to paycheck, trapped between debt, addiction, stress, and hopelessness. And slowly, the country started accepting this as normal. That's the moment when the illusion truly breaks. Because once a society becomes comfortable stepping over human suffering every day, it means the problem is no longer temporary. It means something deep inside the system has already started rotting. Modern America feels less like a country and more like a giant casino that never closes. From the outside, everything still looks impressive. Bright lights, giant screens, luxury brands, endless entertainment. The entire system is designed to create the feeling that money, success, and opportunity are everywhere. But a casino is not built for most people to win. It survives because millions keep losing slowly while believing their lucky break is still coming. And that's probably the best way to understand what happened to the American dream. For decades, people were taught that hard work guaranteed success. Study hard, get a degree, work full-time, buy a house, and eventually life would become stable and comfortable. But today, huge numbers of Americans feel like they're running faster every year while somehow falling further behind. The system became a machine built on permanent debt. Everything starts early. Young people leave college carrying massive student loans before they even begin adult life. Then come credit cards, car payments, rising rent, medical bills, insurance, and mortgages that stretch across decades. The average person spends most of their life owing money to somebody. And the terrifying part is that many people no longer even see this as strange. Debt became normal. The famous credit score turned into an invisible leash, controlling almost every part of life. In America, your financial rating affects where you can live, what kind of car you can drive, what loans you can get, and sometimes even what jobs you qualify for. One missed payment can start destroying your entire future, so people stay trapped inside the cycle. They work longer hours, skip vacations, ignore exhaustion. They panic about getting sick because a medical emergency can financially ruin a family overnight. Millions of people are constantly calculating bills, checking bank accounts, and worrying about expenses. The system functions like a treadmill that keeps speeding up. You run harder every year, but you never actually escape. For a long time, the middle class was the foundation of American stability. Ordinary workers could afford homes, raise children, and build savings. That stability is disappearing fast. Housing prices exploded beyond what normal salaries can support. Rent consumes huge portions of monthly income. Owning a home now feels impossible for younger generations, unless they accept decades of financial pressure. Even basic security became a luxury, and the healthcare system pushes the pressure even further. America has some of the most advanced hospitals and medical technology in the world, but for millions of people, getting sick feels financially terrifying. Ambulance rides can cost thousands of dollars. Surgeries create enormous debt. Insurance companies hide behind complicated contracts and technical loopholes. Many people delay treatment because they simply cannot afford it. Some even travel to Mexico for cheaper medication because prices inside the United States became absurdly high. Illness stopped being only a health problem. It became an economic disaster waiting to happen. The education system works in a similar way. Young people were promised that college was the path to success, so they signed enormous loan agreements, believing their future income would justify the cost. But many graduated into unstable job markets, while their debt kept growing through interest. Now millions of educated workers spend years trapped between low wages and endless payments. The dream of upward mobility slowly transformed into financial survival. At the same time, politicians continue talking about economic growth and strong employment numbers. But many of those jobs are temporary, unstable, or poorly paid. The gig economy was sold as freedom and flexibility. In reality, it often removed security, benefits, and long-term stability. Drivers, delivery workers, freelancers, and app-based employees are managed by algorithms instead of humans. A computer system can cut their income, punish them for ratings, or deactivate them instantly without explanation. Workers became replaceable parts inside giant digital systems, and this is where the casino metaphor becomes even more accurate. Inside a casino, people keep playing even after losing huge amounts of money, because they still believe the next round could change everything. Walking away feels like failure. That's exactly what millions of Americans experience now. They continue working harder, borrowing more, and chasing stability because they still hope the system will eventually reward them. But the structure itself changed. Wealth keeps concentrating at the top, while financial pressure keeps flowing downward toward everyone else. And despite all the lights, advertising, and patriotic slogans, more and more people are beginning to realize something painful. The game was never really designed for most of them to win. For a long time, the United States presented itself as the ultimate example of stability, progress, and modern civilization. It looked powerful, organized, and untouchable. But over the years, cracks started appearing everywhere. And today, those cracks have become impossible to hide. The biggest problem is not one single crisis. The real problem is that multiple parts of the system are failing at the same time. America's infrastructure is aging rapidly. Roads are collapsing, bridges are deteriorating, power grids are overloaded, and water systems are decades old. For years, trillions of dollars were spent on military expansion, global influence, and endless foreign operations, while the country's own foundation slowly rotted underneath. In many cities, driving feels like navigating through permanent construction zones and damaged highways. Massive freight trains carrying toxic chemicals travel across outdated rail systems that desperately need repairs. Accidents happen more often now. Derailments, industrial leaks, and environmental disasters no longer feel shocking. They feel routine, and when these disasters happen, giant corporations often pay relatively small fines and continue operating like nothing changed. Because for many companies, investing in proper safety costs more than simply dealing with the consequences later. That same logic spreads through almost every part of society. The electrical grid struggles during heat waves, winter storms, and natural disasters. Entire regions lose power for days. Families freeze inside their homes while energy companies continue sending enormous bills. In some parts of the country, people still cannot trust the water coming from their own faucets. Communities deal with contaminated pipes, lead exposure, and polluted water supplies, while politicians stand in front of cameras repeating that everything is under control. The gap between official messaging and daily reality keeps growing wider, but the deepest system failure is economic and social. The American middle class, once considered the backbone of the country, is shrinking fast. Decades ago, ordinary workers could support families, buy homes, save money, and build stable futures through full-time work. Now millions work harder than ever while barely surviving. Wages stopped keeping up with living costs a long time ago, but housing, healthcare, education, food, insurance, and transportation continue becoming more expensive every year. The result is simple. People are exhausted. Millions survive through constant borrowing. Credit cards, student loans, car payments, mortgages, and medical debt became permanent parts of normal life. Debt is no longer temporary. For many Americans, it became a lifelong condition. And while ordinary citizens drown financially, major banks and financial institutions continue reporting enormous profits. That creates a growing sense of betrayal. When giant corporations fail because of reckless financial behavior, governments often rescue them with taxpayer money. But when ordinary workers lose jobs or face medical emergencies, they are usually left alone to deal with the consequences. People increasingly feel that the rules are completely different depending on how much money you already have. Fear became a normal part of daily life. Fear of losing health insurance, fear of getting sick, fear of missing payments, fear of unemployment, fear of financial collapse. The system creates permanent instability for the majority while offering extreme protection for those already at the top. Work itself also changed dramatically. The rise of the gig economy transformed millions of traditional jobs into temporary app-based labor. Tech companies marketed this as freedom and flexibility. Be your own boss. Work whenever you want. But the reality looks very different. Many workers lost healthcare benefits, retirement plans, paid vacations, and long-term job security. Delivery drivers, rideshare workers, freelancers, and warehouse employees now operate under algorithmic management systems that monitor every movement. An app decides how much they earn. An app decides whether they keep working. A bad rating or automated system error can instantly destroy someone's income with almost no human oversight. Workers became disposable. And while technology companies celebrate innovation and efficiency, millions of people feel more economically fragile than previous generations ever did. Higher education tells a similar story. For decades, Americans were told college was the guaranteed path towards success and stability. Young people signed enormous student loan agreements, believing future salaries would make everything worthwhile. Instead, many graduated into unstable job markets, carrying crushing debt they cannot escape. Some work low-paying service jobs despite expensive degrees. Others spend decades paying interest while never significantly reducing the original balance. The system transformed education into another financial trap. And unlike many other debts, student loans are extremely difficult to erase, even through bankruptcy. That means millions begin adulthood financially trapped before their careers even fully start. Healthcare may be the clearest example of system failure. America possesses incredible hospitals, advanced research, and world-class medical technology. Yet millions of citizens live terrified of medical bills. A simple ambulance ride can cost thousands of dollars. Surgeries create massive debt. Insurance companies deny claims through technical loopholes and endless paperwork. Families organize online fundraisers to pay for cancer treatment, emergency operations, or life-saving medication. In many cases, people delay treatment because they literally cannot afford to get sick. That changes the psychological structure of society itself. Illness stops feeling like a human tragedy and starts feeling like a financial threat. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical corporations continue generating massive profits while medication prices keep climbing. Political institutions also appear increasingly dysfunctional. The country lives in a constant state of political warfare. Every election feels apocalyptic. Every debate turns into outrage, fear, and accusations. Compromise became almost impossible because political division now drives media ratings, social media engagement, and fundraising. Anger became profitable. Television networks compete for emotional reactions instead of thoughtful discussion. Social media algorithms push people toward increasingly extreme content because outrage keeps users engaged longer. As a result, millions of Americans no longer simply disagree politically. They distrust each other completely. Families stop speaking over politics. Friendships collapse. Neighbors view one another as enemies. The country feels less like a united society and more like rival tribes sharing the same territory. And through all of this, the largest corporations and financial interests continue operating comfortably above the chaos. That's why so many people lost faith in institutions entirely. They no longer trust politicians. They no longer trust media. They no longer trust corporations. They no longer trust the system itself. And when trust disappears on that scale, the danger becomes much bigger than economics. Because societies can survive recessions. They can survive scandals. They can survive political conflict. But once people stop believing the system works fairly at all, instability accelerates very quickly. That is where America increasingly finds itself today. The country still projects enormous power outwardly. Its military remains dominant. Its technology shapes the modern world. Its financial influence is still massive. But internally, something feels deeply unstable. Like a giant building still standing tall, while the support beams inside slowly crack apart under the pressure. The real collapse does not begin in government buildings or on Wall Street trading floors. It begins much lower, inside ordinary daily life. It starts the moment basic stability becomes difficult to maintain. For decades, the idea of a normal American life seemed simple and achievable. Work hard, buy a house, raise a family, save money, and slowly build a comfortable future. Today, for millions of people, even those basic goals feel increasingly unreachable. Housing became one of the biggest sources of fear. Home prices exploded far beyond what average salaries can realistically support. Rent continues rising year after year in major cities and even in smaller towns. Many full-time workers still cannot afford to live alone. Families squeeze into tiny apartments. Young adults remain with their parents far longer than previous generations because independence became financially impossible. And hanging over everything is the constant fear of homelessness. Millions of Americans know that one emergency could destroy their entire situation. Losing a job, getting injured, or missing a few rent payments can quickly push someone from stability into disaster. That fear changes how people live. They avoid vacations. They delay having children. They skip medical appointments. They work while exhausted and sick because stopping even briefly feels dangerous. People constantly check bank accounts, calculate bills, and panic about unexpected expenses. Financial stress became permanent background noise in everyday life. The pressure hits younger generations especially hard. Many millennials and Gen Z workers grew up believing they would eventually live better than their parents. Instead, many feel trapped in a reality where they work more, own less, and carry far more debt. A huge number of young adults juggle multiple jobs just to survive. They work office shifts during the day, drive for delivery apps at night, and search for side income on weekends. And despite all that effort, many still cannot build savings or long-term security. Life begins to feel like endless maintenance instead of progress. That constant pressure creates massive emotional exhaustion. Anxiety and depression rates continue rising across the country. Millions rely on antidepressants, sleeping pills, anti-anxiety medication, or alcohol simply to function normally. Burnout became so common that people almost joke about it now. But beneath the jokes is something darker. People are mentally overwhelmed. The modern American lifestyle leaves little room for rest, connection, or emotional recovery. Long work hours, financial insecurity, constant bad news, and non-stop digital stimulation create a society that feels permanently tense. Relationships suffer because of it. Families spend less time together. Friendships weaken. People feel isolated even when surrounded by crowds. Many workers barely have energy left after surviving the work week. And while physical loneliness grows, digital dependence becomes stronger. Social media filled the emotional vacuum for millions of people. But instead of making society healthier, it often made insecurity worse. Platforms constantly display perfect bodies, luxury lifestyles, expensive vacations, and carefully edited success stories. People compare their real lives to fake online performances all day long. That destroys self-worth over time, especially among teenagers and young adults. Entire generations grew up attached to glowing screens. Many struggle with attention spans, emotional regulation, and real-world communication because their brains developed inside algorithm-driven digital environments. Tech companies discovered something extremely profitable. Fear, outrage, insecurity, and emotional conflict keep people online longer than peace or happiness. So algorithms feed users exactly those emotions. The result is a non-stop stream of anxiety and division. Political rage, social conflict, public humiliation, conspiracy theories, and emotional manipulation became part of normal daily consumption. And after years inside that environment, people begin losing trust in each other. That mistrust spreads into everyday interactions. Americans increasingly live in a culture shaped by fear and suspicion. Many install security cameras, alarm systems, reinforced doors, and firearms inside their homes because they feel unsafe. In some cities, public spaces feel emotionally tense all the time. A simple argument in traffic can escalate into violence. Random confrontations feel dangerous because almost everyone assumes the other person may be armed, unstable, or aggressive. Fear slowly poisons ordinary social behavior. Mass shootings intensified this feeling even further. School children now regularly practice active shooter drills. Young kids learn how to hide quietly in classrooms, lock doors, and prepare for the possibility of armed attacks. For many American children, this became a normal part of growing up. That leaves deep psychological damage. At the same time, political leaders continue repeating the same arguments after every tragedy, while little fundamentally changes. Gun companies continue generating enormous profits. News cycles move on quickly. Society adapts to another horror and keeps going. The country became emotionally numb to violence. Food insecurity also continues growing. Despite America's enormous wealth and production capacity, millions of families rely on food banks and government assistance programs. Inflation made groceries dramatically more expensive, while wages remained relatively stagnant. Many working families now carefully calculate basic grocery purchases every week. The feeling of economic fragility spread far beyond traditionally poor communities. Even people with decent jobs increasingly feel unstable. They worry about healthcare costs, rising rent, debt payments, retirement savings, childcare expenses, and future uncertainty all at once. And after years of carrying this pressure non-stop, something inside society begins breaking down emotionally. People stop thinking long-term. They stop imagining a stable future. They focus only on surviving the next month, the next payment, the next emergency. That may be the clearest sign of social collapse, because when an entire population becomes psychologically trapped in short-term survival mode, the future itself starts disappearing. Hope weakens, trust weakens, patience weakens. And once those things begin collapsing across millions of ordinary lives at the same time, the damage spreads far beyond economics. It changes the emotional foundation of the entire country. America still looks wealthy from the outside. The lights are still bright. The entertainment never stops. The advertisements still promise happiness and success. But beneath all of that, millions of people are quietly exhausted, anxious, isolated, and afraid. And that kind of pressure cannot build forever without consequences. Whenever a society starts falling apart like this, one question always appears sooner or later. Who is responsible? Who allowed things to reach this point? A lot of people want a simple answer. Some blame politicians, others blame billionaires, immigrants, corporations, social media, banks, or cultural changes. But the truth is much more complicated and much more uncomfortable. The crisis did not come from one person or one government. It developed slowly over decades as more and more parts of society became controlled by money, profit, and political manipulation. Politics itself turned into a massive business. Modern election campaigns cost enormous amounts of money. Candidates need constant financial support to survive politically, and that support rarely comes from ordinary citizens. It comes from giant corporations, lobbying groups, wealthy donors, pharmaceutical companies, military contractors, financial institutions, and tech giants. And none of them give money for free. Every industry wants influence. Every corporation wants favorable laws, tax advantages, government contracts, or protection from regulation. That's why millions of Americans increasingly feel that politicians no longer truly represent ordinary people. They represent systems of money. The pharmaceutical industry pushes policies that protect profits. Defense contractors benefit from endless military spending. Banks influence financial regulation. Tech corporations fight for control over data, communication, and digital markets. Meanwhile, the average citizen feels smaller and more powerless every year. Elections still happen. Political debates continue non-stop. Television networks present politics like dramatic entertainment. But many people suspect the most important decisions are made far above public influence. That creates deep frustration, because people still technically have the right to vote, yet many no longer believe voting changes the core structure of the system itself. The media also plays a major role in the collapse. For decades, television and newspapers helped create a shared understanding of reality. Today, that shared reality barely exists anymore. Different news networks, websites, influencers, and online communities now operate inside completely separate worlds. And because media companies compete for attention, emotional intensity became more valuable than truth or nuance. Fear gets ratings, anger gets clicks, conflict generates engagement, so the system constantly rewards outrage. Every issue becomes a battlefield. Every political disagreement becomes a moral war. Every news story is presented in the most emotionally explosive way possible, because emotional audiences stay connected longer. The result is a population trapped in permanent psychological tension. Social media accelerated this process dramatically. Algorithms discovered that people spend more time online when they feel angry, threatened, or emotionally activated. So platforms increasingly push extreme content, because it performs better commercially. Over time, millions of people became trapped inside isolated digital bubbles, where they mostly hear opinions that reinforce their fears and biases. That destroyed trust between groups. Political opponents stopped feeling like fellow citizens with different views. They became enemies, dangerous enemies. Many Americans now genuinely believe the other side threatens the survival of the country itself. Society started breaking into hostile tribes, and the more divided a population becomes, the easier it is to manipulate. While ordinary people fight endlessly over cultural issues, identity politics, social conflicts, and online outrage, the largest economic structures continue operating almost untouched. Wealth continues concentrating upward, corporate influence continues growing, and public attention stays distracted. Tech corporations carry enormous responsibility too. For years, they promised to connect humanity, spread information, and make society more open and democratic. Instead, many created systems capable of shaping human behavior on a massive scale. These companies know what people buy, what they fear, what they search for, what makes them angry, what makes them insecure, and even what keeps them emotionally addicted to screens. Human attention became the most valuable product in the modern economy, and users themselves became the product being sold. The longer people stay online, the more profitable they become. So platforms constantly optimize for addiction, emotional stimulation, and endless engagement. Notifications, short videos, outrage cycles, endless scrolling. All of it is carefully designed to keep people psychologically hooked. Many people can barely focus anymore without checking their phones every few minutes. Silence feels uncomfortable. Boredom feels unbearable. Constant stimulation rewired daily life. Technology stopped being just a tool. It started shaping human behavior itself. But responsibility does not belong only to elites and corporations. Society also participated in this system willingly. For years, millions embraced a culture built around endless consumption. Success became tied to expensive lifestyles, new technology, luxury brands, bigger houses, and public image. People were encouraged to spend constantly, even when they could not truly afford it. Credit made everything temporarily accessible, and corporations understood perfectly how to profit from insecurity and desire. Advertising convinced people that happiness could be purchased, that identity could be built through products, that social status depended on consumption. Over time, debt-driven consumerism became part of normal life. At the same time, many citizens slowly disconnected from deeper civic participation. Politics became entertainment. Public attention fragmented into distractions, celebrity culture, online arguments, and non-stop digital noise. Meanwhile, structural problems kept growing quietly underneath. Housing became unaffordable. Healthcare became terrifyingly expensive. Education became a debt machine. Infrastructure aged. Mental health deteriorated. Trust collapsed. Economic inequality exploded. But facing the full scale of the problem feels emotionally overwhelming. So many people prefer distraction. They hope technology will solve everything automatically. They hope the economy will somehow stabilize itself. They wait for a politician, a movement, or some future innovation to magically reverse decades of damage. But the pressure keeps building. And perhaps the most dangerous part is this: the people most responsible for shaping the system are often the least affected by its consequences. Billionaires can isolate themselves from instability. Political elites live protected lives far away from ordinary economic stress. Major corporations survive crises much more easily than normal families do. The real pressure falls on workers, students, parents, small business owners, and ordinary citizens trying to survive daily life. And after years of stress, disappointment, and insecurity, frustration slowly transforms into resentment. Millions feel they followed the rules, worked hard, stayed patient, and still ended up trapped inside a system that no longer rewards effort the way it once promised. That growing resentment creates an extremely unstable society, because once people lose trust in institutions, lose faith in the future, and lose belief that the system treats them fairly, something very dangerous begins to form underneath the surface. A society full of exhausted people searching for someone to blame while everything around them continues getting worse. Every empire in history believed at some point that its power was permanent. That belief is always strongest right before decline begins. The United States is no exception. It still looks powerful from the outside, militarily dominant, technologically advanced, financially influential. But internally, the structure is becoming increasingly unstable, and that instability is starting to define its future. The most dangerous part is not a single crisis. It is the accumulation of many crises that are now converging at the same time. The economic system is under long-term pressure. For decades, American global influence was supported by the strength of its currency, its debt-based growth model, and worldwide trust in its financial institutions. The dollar functioned as the center of global trade, allowing the country to sustain massive spending while borrowing at scale without immediate consequences. But debt has now reached extreme levels. The system continues operating only because new borrowing constantly replaces old obligations. This works for a time, but it is not a permanent solution. At some point, confidence becomes fragile, and when confidence begins to weaken, financial systems can shift quickly and unpredictably. Already, parts of the global economy are slowly diversifying. New trade agreements, alternative currencies, and regional financial systems are emerging. The idea that one country will remain the unquestioned center of global economics forever is no longer taken for granted. If that shift accelerates, the internal impact could be severe, because the American lifestyle is deeply dependent on continuous financial expansion, easy credit, consumer spending, and stable global demand for its currency. If those conditions weaken, the consequences would not be abstract. They would be felt directly in everyday life: job losses, shrinking pensions, rising prices, collapsing savings, and reduced access to basic services. And a society that is already emotionally exhausted does not handle sudden economic shock well. At the same time, internal polarization continues to deepen. The country is not just politically divided anymore. It is culturally and emotionally fragmented. Large groups of people no longer share the same interpretation of reality, institutions, or even basic trust in information sources. That fragmentation creates instability because it removes the common ground required for collective decision-making. In such an environment, even minor crises can escalate quickly. Economic downturns could trigger large-scale protests. Political conflicts could become more intense and less predictable. Social tension could spill into violence in different regions, and the state response would likely become more forceful, increasing surveillance, policing, and control mechanisms. But those responses would not address root causes. They would only increase pressure. Another major vulnerability is infrastructure. Aging power grids, outdated transportation systems, weak public utilities, and underfunded maintenance create a system that is increasingly fragile under stress. Extreme weather events, cyber attacks, or major technical failures could disrupt large parts of the country simultaneously. And unlike in the past, recovery would be slower and more complicated, because systems are now more interconnected, more digital, and more dependent on aging physical foundations that were never fully modernized. there is also a growing risk linked to automation and artificial intelligence. Millions of jobs could be reshaped or replaced in a relatively short time. Office work, logistics, customer service, driving, and even parts of healthcare and legal work are already being affected by automation systems. If this transition happens faster than society can adapt, it could create large-scale unemployment or underemployment. And in a country where many people already live close to financial breaking points, even small disruptions in income can have serious consequences. That creates a dangerous feedback loop. Economic stress increases social tension. Social tension increases political instability, and political instability makes economic recovery more difficult. Meanwhile, digital systems are becoming more powerful than traditional institutions in shaping public behavior. Social platforms, recommendation algorithms, and artificial intelligence systems already influence what people see, believe, and feel on a massive scale. This influence will likely grow. Future governments and corporations may have even more advanced tools for monitoring populations, predicting behavior, and managing information flow. While these systems can be presented as efficiency improvements or security tools, they also carry the risk of increasing surveillance and reducing personal autonomy. At the same time, trust in institutions continues to weaken. Political institutions struggle with credibility. Media environments are fragmented and often viewed as biased or manipulative. Economic institutions are seen as unfair by large parts of the population, and corporate power is widely perceived as excessive. A society without trust becomes difficult to stabilize during crises, because cooperation depends on shared belief in fairness and legitimacy. Without that, every crisis becomes more chaotic. The historical pattern is important here. Large empires rarely collapse from one dramatic event. More often, they experience gradual internal weakening, rising inequality, declining trust, institutional overload, and growing distance between elites and the general population. Over time, these pressures accumulate until the system can no longer absorb shocks. The United States is increasingly showing similar structural patterns. Rising inequality concentrates wealth at the top, while large segments of the population experience stagnation or decline in living standards. Political systems become more reactive than strategic. Public discourse becomes more emotional and less constructive. And long-term planning is often replaced by short-term crisis management. In this environment, even external shocks, financial crises, wars, pandemics, or technological disruptions become more dangerous because internal resilience is weaker than before. Another key factor is psychological fatigue. Millions of people now experience chronic stress, financial anxiety, and social uncertainty. That emotional condition affects decision-making at every level of society. It reduces patience, increases aggression, and weakens long-term thinking. A society in constant stress tends to react instead of plan, and reaction-based systems are inherently unstable over time. Eventually, the combination of economic fragility, political polarization, technological disruption, and emotional exhaustion creates a situation where small triggers can produce large consequences. What once looked like stability begins to behave more like tension under pressure. A structure that appears strong externally, but internally is carrying stress across too many points at once. In such systems, collapse does not always happen as a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it unfolds as a series of accelerating failures that reinforce each other until the system can no longer maintain balance. And at that point, the outcome is no longer about prediction. It becomes about timing. Every empire in history believed it was different, that it had solved the problems that destroyed the ones before it, that it was more advanced, more intelligent, more stable, more modern than anything that came before. And because of that belief, it assumed it would not fall in the same way. The United States still carries that same illusion. From the outside, it still looks like the center of global power. Its military presence spans the planet. Its companies dominate technology, media, and finance. Its culture still spreads everywhere through entertainment and digital platforms. It still feels like the final version of a superpower. But internally, something very different is happening. The system is no longer simply facing problems. It is absorbing too many failures at once. Economic pressure, social fragmentation, political hostility, technological disruption, institutional distrust, and psychological exhaustion are no longer separate issues. They are merging into a single, interconnected condition that slowly weakens the entire structure. And that is what makes the situation dangerous. Because systems do not collapse only when they are weak. They collapse when they become too stressed to adapt. The economy still functions, but it increasingly relies on unstable foundations, debt expansion, financial engineering, and continuous consumption. That structure can survive for a long time, but only as long as confidence remains intact. And confidence is exactly what is slowly eroding. At the same time, society is losing its internal cohesion. People no longer agree on basic reality. They consume different information, trust different institutions, and live in different emotional worlds. Neighbors, families, and communities are increasingly divided, not just by opinion, but by identity and perception of truth itself. That kind of fragmentation is historically significant. Because when a society stops sharing a common understanding of reality, coordination becomes extremely difficult. And without coordination, even simple problems become harder to solve. Political institutions are trapped in this environment. They operate inside permanent conflict cycles, where short-term victories matter more than long-term stability. Media systems amplify division because conflict drives attention. Social platforms amplify outrage because emotion drives engagement. And economic interests continue to shape policy behind the scenes. The result is a system that reacts constantly, but rarely stabilizes. Meanwhile, everyday life for ordinary people continues to degrade. Housing becomes less accessible. Healthcare becomes more expensive. Education creates long-term debt instead of mobility. Work becomes more unstable. And psychological pressure becomes constant rather than occasional. For millions of people, life feels like permanent maintenance rather than progress. That is a critical shift. Because when people stop believing in upward mobility, they also begin to lose trust in the legitimacy of the system itself. And once that belief weakens at scale, political and social stability become much harder to maintain. Technology does not solve this problem. In many ways, it intensifies it. Artificial intelligence, automation, and algorithmic systems are increasing efficiency, but they are also reducing predictability in labor markets and concentrating power in fewer hands. The same tools that create innovation also create displacement, and displacement without stability creates tension. Social media and digital ecosystems add another layer. They do not just reflect society, they actively shape it. They influence attention, emotions, beliefs, and behavior at scale. They fragment shared reality into thousands of isolated information environments. Over time, this reduces empathy and increases suspicion. People become more reactive, less patient, and more emotionally polarized. And a polarized society is much harder to govern peacefully. The most important point is that none of these problems exist in isolation anymore. They reinforce each other. Economic stress increases political anger. Political anger increases institutional distrust. Institutional distrust reduces cooperation. Reduced cooperation weakens economic stability. Technological disruption amplifies uncertainty, and uncertainty increases psychological stress. This creates a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing system of pressure. Historically, when societies enter this kind of loop, the process of decline often accelerates faster than expected, not because of one catastrophic moment, but because each small failure increases the probability of the next one. That is why the future becomes difficult to predict in a precise way. Not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening at once. At the same time, the physical infrastructure of the country continues to age. Transportation networks, energy systems, water supplies, and industrial foundations all require massive long-term investment. But political and economic attention is often focused elsewhere. This creates a dangerous imbalance between external projection of power and internal maintenance of stability. A country can project strength globally for a long time, even while internal systems slowly degrade. But eventually, internal weakness begins to limit external power. The most unsettling part of this entire trajectory is psychological. Large parts of the population are no longer thinking in terms of long-term growth or collective progress. Instead, many are focused on short-term survival, emotional coping, or constant distraction. When a society loses its forward-looking mindset, it begins to lose direction. And when direction is lost, institutions alone are not enough to stabilize it. At this stage, the future is no longer about one single outcome. It is about range of possibilities. Some scenarios involve gradual decline and restructuring. Others involve sharper crises, followed by forced adaptation. Some involve internal fragmentation into more localized systems. Others involve external shocks that accelerate existing weaknesses. What connects all of them is pressure. Sustained pressure across economic, social, technological, and political layers. The final reality is simple but uncomfortable. Systems do not fail because they suddenly collapse from one point. They fail because too many parts stop working well at the same time for too long. And once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to stop without significant transformation. The United States is not in a moment of immediate disappearance. It is in a moment of accumulated stress, a phase where the gap between external appearance and internal condition keeps widening. And history suggests that when that gap becomes too large, reality eventually corrects it. Not slowly, but all at once, in ways that often surprise even those who expected change. That is the final verdict. Not an ending written in a single moment, but the beginning of a long transition where the outcome depends on how much pressure the system can still absorb before it can no longer hold itself together.